Hi, friends. Welcome back to True Crime Echoes. If you're new here, my name is True Crime Echoes, and every week we take a deep dive into some of the darkest, strangest, and most haunting true crime stories from history and modern times. I don't just want to tell you what happened, I want us to explore why it happened, what it meant, and how those echoes of the past still reach us today. The story I'm about to share with you is one of those cases that feels almost unreal, like it belongs in a gothic novel or a horror film. But it's real, or at least rooted in real events, that still leave historians arguing centuries later. We're going back to 16th century Hungary to the life of a noblewoman whose name has become legendary, Elizabeth Bathory. You may have heard her called the Blood Countess, or even compared to Dracula. Her story is one of privilege, scandal, and unimaginable cruelty. And whether the numbers tied to her name are truth or myth, her legacy forces us to question the way power and violence intertwine. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's unravel the chilling life and crimes of Elizabeth Bathory. Chapter 1: The Blood Countess, Between Legend and Reality. Hi friends, how are you today? I always like to start by checking in, because the story I'm about to share with you is heavy, and sometimes it helps to ground ourselves first. So let me ask you something. Have you ever heard the legend of a woman who bathed in the blood of her victims, all in the name of beauty? It sounds like something straight out of a horror novel or a vampire movie, right? But as chilling as it sounds, the roots of that legend trace back to a very real person. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, often called the Blood Countess. And depending on which version of the story you've heard, she was either one of history's most terrifying female serial killers, or she became the victim of rumors so dark they've haunted her name for centuries. Either way, her story has left behind a trail of fascination, fear, and unanswered questions. I want to take you back to 16th century Hungary, a world where noble families ruled with power, where politics and bloodlines were everything, and where science hadn't yet caught up with the mysteries of medicine. It was a time when superstition lived side by side with religion, and sometimes the two became inseparable. In this world, Elizabeth Bathory was born into immense wealth and privilege. From the outside, it might have looked like she had it all: castles, servants, a name that commanded respect. But underneath that surface, there were cracks that would eventually widen into something truly monstrous. When I first read about Elizabeth Bathory, I couldn't help but think about how legends grow. You know how a story gets passed from one person to another, and with each retelling it changes just a little, like a game of telephone. With Elizabeth, it's hard to separate the facts from the myths. Did she really kill hundreds of young girls? Or was the story exaggerated by her enemies to strip her of power? What we do know for certain is that her life was steeped in violent secrecy and scandal, and it's those shadows of truth that make her story impossible to ignore. Now, I'm not going to lie, this story is disturbing. The details of what Elizabeth Bathory allegedly did are shocking even by today's standards. But I think that's exactly why it's important to talk about them. True crime isn't just about the gore or the sensational headlines. It's about understanding the world that allowed these crimes to happen and asking ourselves how much of it was circumstance, how much of it was choice, and how much of it was the imagination of people who wanted to believe in monsters. So today, I want you to join me as we unravel the story of Elizabeth Bathory. We'll start at the very beginning in her childhood, where privilege mixed with illness, superstition, and strict family traditions. Because if we want to understand the woman history calls the Blood Countess, we first need to understand the girl she once was. Chapter 2: Elizabeth's Childhood and Family Background. Elizabeth Bathory was born into one of the most powerful families in Hungary sometime around 1560 or 1561. Historians still debate the exact year because record-keeping back then wasn't always precise, but what's clear is that she entered the world already wrapped in privilege. Her family name carried enormous weight. The Bathorys controlled vast estates, had political influence, and their bloodline was considered among the most prestigious in Eastern Europe. From the very beginning, Elizabeth was destined to hold power. But the thing about noble families during that era was that bloodlines mattered more than anything, And when I say bloodlines, I mean it literally. To keep their wealth and influence concentrated, many noble families practiced inbreeding, marrying cousins or other close relatives to preserve what they called pure lineage. The Bathorys were no exception. Elizabeth's parents were blood relatives, and while that was normal for their class, it often came with consequences. Elizabeth grew up suffering from frequent and severe seizures, which today we would recognize as epilepsy. At the time, though, medicine was far from advanced, and people didn't really understand what epilepsy was. Instead, treatments were based on superstition and tradition, some of which sound horrifying to us now. For example, one so-called remedy involved smearing the blood of a non-epileptic person onto the lips of someone with seizures, as if their strength could be transferred through blood. Another treatment required grinding up parts of a human skull, mixing it with blood, and giving it as a kind of tonic. Can you imagine being a child and being told this was medicine? Historians believe Elizabeth was subjected to these treatments from a young age. If that's true, then from the very beginning she was exposed to the idea that blood and human remains had healing power. And if you think about it, those early lessons, however twisted, could have shaped how she saw the world and the human body. It doesn't excuse what she would later become, but it might explain how blood became so deeply tied to her sense of control, health, and maybe even beauty. Despite her illnesses, Elizabeth's childhood wasn't lacking in privilege. She was educated in languages, something not common even for nobles at the time. She spoke Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. That tells us she was highly intelligent, curious, and prepared for a life where knowledge and diplomacy would be as important as wealth. She was also raised in a deeply religious household where strict rules and moral codes dictated daily life. That combination of strict discipline and immense privilege created a strange balance, one where she was both sheltered and empowered. But childhood privilege didn't shield her from the darker side of aristocratic life. By the time she was 10 years old, Elizabeth was already promised in marriage. Arranged marriages were common among noble families because they weren't about love. They were about alliances strengthening power between two houses. For Elizabeth, her marriage would tie her to another influential family, the Nadasdis. This meant that even as a child, her life wasn't her own, it was a political tool. What fascinates me here is the duality of her early life. On one hand, Elizabeth was given everything: education, status, luxury. On the other hand, she grew up with illness, surrounded by bizarre medical rituals, and stripped of personal choice by the demands of her family. It makes me wonder, did these contradictions plant the seeds for what she would later become? Was she shaped into a monster by circumstance, or was there something darker already inside her waiting to be awakened? One thing is certain: Elizabeth Bathory didn't grow up like an ordinary child. She grew up in a world where blood power and control were already intertwined, and that foundation set the stage for everything that would follow. Chapter 3: Elizabeth's Marriage and Early Scandals. By the time Elizabeth Bathory was 13 years old, her life took a turn that would spark whispers for centuries. There's a rumor, one of those persistent details historians still argue about, that she gave birth to a child fathered not by her future husband, but by a young servant boy from the village. For a noble family as powerful as the Bathorys, this was scandalous. Imagine the shame, the fear of gossip spreading among other noble families. A child born outside of her engagement could have destroyed the marriage alliance they were carefully arranging. What happened to that baby is still debated. Some sources say Elizabeth's family forced her to give the child away to a trusted woman, someone who could raise the baby far from the public eye. Others suggest darker outcomes, but what we know for sure is that the child did not stay with Elizabeth. She was young, powerless, and living under the crushing expectations of her family's reputation. That baby was taken, and the scandal was swept away. 2 years later, at the age of 15, Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy, a 19-year-old nobleman from another powerful Hungarian family. Their wedding in 1575 was massive. Over 4,000 guests filled the halls and courtyards, a display of wealth and influence designed not just to celebrate, but to show the rest of Hungary just how untouchable these families were. Elizabeth's status was actually higher than her husband's, which was unusual for the time, and Ferenc even took her surname, Bathory, to strengthen the family brand. On the surface, it looked like the perfect union, two powerful houses joined together, young, wealthy, and ambitious. But beneath that grand display, there were cracks. As a wedding gift, Ferenc gave Elizabeth a castle. Sounds romantic, right? But this wasn't just any castle, it came with a dark addition. He had a torture chamber built to her specifications. That detail is chilling, because it suggests not only that Elizabeth already had a taste for cruelty, but that her husband either indulged it or shared it. Ferenc himself was often away leading troops in battle against the Ottoman Empire. He became known as a fierce military commander, someone who embraced violence as a way of life. Some historians argue that Elizabeth and Ferenc bonded over their shared brutality. When he was home, he may have even participated in some of her darker hobbies. And when he was gone, which was often, Elizabeth had free reign over the castle and the people within it. She wasn't just a noblewoman locked away in a tower. Elizabeth managed estates, handled business affairs, and commanded respect. But she also developed a reputation for cruelty. Servants whispered about punishments that went far beyond the norm. And when her husband was away, those punishments escalated. It's as if she felt untouchable in his absence, free to experiment with her impulses. The marriage lasted 25 years. That's a long time, especially in an age when sickness and war claimed lives so easily. But in 1604, Ferenc died after suffering from a mysterious illness that left him unable to walk. Some say it was natural. Others whisper about poison, a slow and agonizing end. With Ferenc gone, Elizabeth was left without restraint. There was no longer a husband to temper her, no one to distract her with war or politics. Whatever shadows had been growing inside her now had space to thrive. And here's the part I find most fascinating. For years, Elizabeth had lived in a world of arranged marriages, political alliances, and family expectations. She had fulfilled her duty as a wife, maintained her family's reputation, and even gained more power through her marriage. But once Ferenc was gone, she was no longer defined by her role as someone's wife. She was free in a way she had never been before. And instead of using that freedom to build, she used it to destroy. The stories that follow her husband's death are some of the darkest ever told about a woman in history. But if we look back, the signs were always there. An early scandal hidden away, a wedding gift turned into a chamber of horror, a marriage where violence was not only tolerated, but encouraged. The foundation of Elizabeth Bathory's cruelty was built long before she ever acted alone. Chapter 4. The beginning of her crimes and her methods of torture. After Ferenc's death in 1604, Elizabeth Bathory entered a new chapter of her life, one where she no longer had a husband to share her reputation, or perhaps to keep her darker tendencies somewhat restrained. And this is where the story takes a turn from unsettling to truly horrifying. Elizabeth had always been feared by her servants. Even before her husband's death, she had a reputation for being strict, quick-tempered, and cruel. But once she had complete control of the estates, and no one to answer to her violence escalated. What began as punishments turned into something far darker, rituals of torture that were carried out not in secrecy, but with the chilling confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. Her victims, at least in the beginning, were almost always peasant girls. These were the daughters of servants, local villagers, lured into the castle with promises of work. In an era when poverty was everywhere and young girls were desperate for employment, it wasn't difficult for Elizabeth to bring them in. And because they were peasants, no one asked questions when they disappeared. That's the heartbreaking truth of it. Their lives were considered disposable by the society they lived in, which gave Elizabeth free rein to prey upon them. The details of what she did to these girls are some of the most disturbing I've ever come across. She was said to beat them savagely sometimes until their bones broke. She burned them with red-hot irons, pressed coins and keys into their skin until it left permanent scars. There are accounts of her jamming needles under their fingernails, a slow and excruciating form of torture. One of the most horrifying stories describes her biting her victims, literally tearing flesh from their faces, shoulders, and arms with her own teeth. And as if that wasn't enough, she sometimes forced them to cook and eat the very flesh that had been bitten from their bodies. Imagine the psychological cruelty in that not just the physical pain, but the humiliation and terror of being forced into such an act. Other times, her methods were slower. She would strip girls naked, cover their bodies in honey, and leave them tied outside where insects, ants, bees, flies would sting and bite them to death. There's something uniquely sadistic about that, as if the suffering had to be prolonged, as if she needed to watch it unfold over hours. Historians believe many of these crimes were sexually motivated. Whether that's true or not, it's clear that Elizabeth took pleasure in the suffering of others. She didn't just kill, she invented ways to break down her victims, to push the boundaries of cruelty. And the fact that she could do all this without consequence for years tells us a lot about the power she held. But the part that really sticks with me is the blood. Elizabeth developed a fixation on it. After torturing or killing her victims, she would drain them of blood. Some stories claim she bathed in it to preserve her youth and beauty. Others say she drank it believing it could cure her epilepsy or keep her young. While we can't be sure which parts are true and which are legend, we know that blood played a central role in her rituals. It became her obsession, her signature. And yet, despite how horrific this all sounds, Elizabeth wasn't alone. She had help. Several loyal servants and companions became her accomplices. They assisted in abducting girls, restraining them, and covering up the aftermath. I often wonder, were they participants out of loyalty, out of fear, or simply out of survival, because for a servant in her castle refusing to help might have meant ending up as the next victim. At first, Elizabeth targeted only peasants, because they were easy to control and easy to erase from the record. But as time went on, she grew bored. Killing peasant girls became too simple, too unremarkable for someone who wanted to feel powerful. And so she raised the stakes. She began targeting the daughters of the local gentry young noblewomen sent to her court to learn etiquette refinement and household management. Parents trusted her with their children, never suspecting the danger that awaited them. That's when her crimes crossed a line she could no longer hide. When peasant girls disappeared, no one listened. But when noble daughters went missing, people noticed. Panic spread among the local families. Rumors swirled whispers about young women entering the castle and never coming out. Elizabeth had grown careless, or perhaps just arrogant, convinced that her title and family connections would shield her forever. Between 1590 and 1610, it's believed that Elizabeth Bathory killed hundreds of girls. The exact number is debated. Some accounts say 50, others 100, and of course, there's the infamous figure of 650, allegedly recorded in her private journals. That number almost sounds impossible, but even if only a fraction of it is true, we're still talking about one of the deadliest women in recorded history. What makes her story so haunting is not just the violence, but the system that allowed it to continue. Her wealth and title gave her protection. Servants who knew the truth were too afraid to speak. Parents of missing peasant girls had no voice in society. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth Bathory acted as though she were above the law, and in many ways, she was. When I think about this stage of her life, what strikes me is how cruelty became normalized for her. The line between punishment and murder blurred until it vanished completely. Each act of violence seemed to fuel the next, escalating in brutality, as if she was constantly testing the limits of what she could do. And because no one stopped her, those limits were endless. This was the beginning of her reign of terror, and it set the stage for the downfall that was still to come. Chapter 5. Escalation. The staggering victim count, and how suspicion grew. The longer Elizabeth Bathory went unchecked, the bolder she became. At first, her victims were peasant girls, those whose disappearances society didn't bother to question. But as the years passed, the thrill of killing young servants no longer seemed enough for her. She wanted more. She wanted victims whose absence would be felt, girls whose bloodlines carried weight. It wasn't just about cruelty anymore, it was about power domination and proving to herself that she could touch even the untouchable. Elizabeth began to target the daughters of lesser nobility. These weren't peasants. These were young women, from families with status often sent to her castle by their parents for training. It was considered an honor to serve in the household of the Bathorys, a chance to learn etiquette, household management, and the ways of the court. Parents believed they were giving their daughters an advantage in life. But behind those castle walls, the reality was a nightmare. This was the escalation that eventually sealed Elizabeth's fate. Because while peasant families had no power to raise alarm, noble families did, and when their daughters started to vanish, questions could no longer be silenced. Whispers spread across the region about girls who went to Elizabeth's court and never returned, about screams heard in the night, about bodies hastily buried in unmarked graves. And then, of course, there's that infamous number, 650. That's the figure most often tied to Elizabeth Bathory, because according to legend, one of her private journals recorded that exact count of victims. Imagine that 650 lives taken over 2 decades. It almost feels unreal, like the number has to be exaggerated. Some historians argue that the truth is far less, maybe closer to 100. But even if we take the lowest estimate, Elizabeth would still rank among the most prolific killers in history. I think this is where myth and reality collide. Was Elizabeth really capable of murdering 650 young women, or did her enemies inflate the number to make her seem more monstrous than she already was? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. But what makes the story so haunting isn't the precise number. It's the fact that she killed enough to make that number believable. Her arrogance also grew with the body count. She stopped hiding her crimes as carefully. In fact, some reports say that bodies were left out in courtyards or buried so shallowly that villagers stumbled across them. Other times, badly beaten girls were seen fleeing the castle only to be dragged back inside by her loyal servants. It was as though Elizabeth believed no one could touch her, and for a long time she was right. Her family's name, her wealth, and her influence created a shield that made her nearly untouchable. But power can only cover up so much blood. By the late 1600s, the whispers had turned into murmurs, and the murmurs into open suspicion. Noble families began talking to each other, realizing that their daughters had all vanished under the same roof. And in a society where honor and reputation were everything, this was no longer something they could ignore. What fascinates me is the psychology behind Elizabeth's escalation. Many serial killers throughout history have followed this same pattern, starting with victims who are vulnerable, whose absence won't raise alarms, and then pushing the boundaries as their confidence grows. With each act, they test how far they can go. And when no one stops them, they take that as proof they can do more. Elizabeth was no different. Her cruelty evolved because her environment allowed it to. She had no accountability, no consequences. Still, there's something almost reckless in the way she shifted her focus to noble girls. It feels like a power move, as if she wanted to demonstrate that she wasn't just feared by peasants, but could also terrorize the upper class. And maybe that was her downfall, when she crossed that invisible line between cruelty that was tolerated and cruelty that could not be ignored. By 1610, the fear surrounding Elizabeth Bathory had reached its breaking point. Families of missing noble girls wanted answers. And finally, someone powerful enough decided to investigate. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth was about to face the possibility that her blood-soaked reign could come to an end. Chapter 6. The Investigation and Arrest of Elizabeth Bathory. By the winter of 1610, the whispers surrounding Elizabeth Bathory had grown too loud to ignore. For years, peasants had quietly mourned their missing daughters, powerless to accuse someone as untouchable as a countess. But now, noble families were beginning to notice the same terrible pattern. Their daughters, too, were vanishing behind the walls of Changed Castle. And when people with power begin to ask questions, even the most protected aristocrats can no longer hide. Enter Count György Thurzo, a powerful figure in Hungarian politics and a man with close ties to Elizabeth's family. He was the Palatine of Hungary, essentially the highest-ranking official under the king. When noble parents approached him with their concerns, he couldn't dismiss them the way peasants had always been dismissed. These were families with influence, connections, and reputations at stake. Something had to be done. What's interesting is that Thurzo had reportedly heard the rumors before. People had been whispering about Elizabeth's cruelty for years, but as long as the victims were poor girls, no one in authority truly cared. It was only when noble blood was on the line that an investigation finally began. That fact alone says so much about the way society worked at the time. So in December of 1610, Count Thurzo rode out to Sete Castle to see the truth for himself. And what he found has been described in documents and letters that still survive today. According to his own account, he entered the castle and followed the sounds of commotion. There, inside one of the chambers, he claimed to have caught Elizabeth in the act, torturing a young girl with another dead body lying nearby. I can only imagine the scene, the cold stone walls, the flicker of torchlight, and the realization that the rumors weren't just rumors. They were real. For Thurzo, this must have been the moment everything crystallized. Elizabeth Bathory was not simply a cruel noblewoman, but a killer whose crimes had gone unchecked for far too long. Following that discovery, Elizabeth was immediately placed under arrest along with several of her closest accomplices. These were the servants and companions who had helped her lure, restrain, and dispose of victims. Some of them, I suspect, acted out of fear rather than loyalty, but when the authorities came, there was no mercy. Everyone connected to her crimes was seized. The testimonies that came out of those arrests painted a chilling picture. Servants described how Elizabeth orchestrated the tortures, how she delighted in watching girls suffer, how the walls of the castle had witnessed unspeakable cruelty. Some confessed under torture themselves, which raises the question of how much was truth and how much was forced. Still, the sheer consistency of their stories left little doubt that something horrific had been happening for years. The arrest of Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just about stopping a killer, it was also about protecting the reputation of the noble class. Executing her outright would have been scandalous, dragging the Bathory name through the mud. And yet letting her go would have been impossible after what Thurzo claimed to witness. The authorities were walking a dangerous line. How do you punish someone so powerful without shattering the social order? Elizabeth, for the first time in her life, was facing the possibility of justice. The woman who once seemed untouchable had finally been caught. But as we'll see, the outcome of her trial and punishment would reveal just how deeply politics, privilege, and power shaped the meaning of justice in her time. Chapter 7. Her Trial. Punishment and Final Years in Isolation. After Elizabeth Bathory's arrest, the question became not whether she was guilty by then. The evidence and testimonies painted a clear enough picture, but how she should be punished. And this is where the story takes on a political edge, because Elizabeth wasn't just another criminal. She was a countess, a member of one of the most powerful families in Hungary. Her trial wasn't only about justice, it was also about reputation, influence, and the delicate balance of power. Her accomplices were dealt with quickly. Several of her closest servants and helpers were tried and executed. Some were burned at the stake, others were mutilated before their deaths. The swiftness of their punishment feels almost symbolic, as if the authorities wanted to draw a clear line. The lower-class participants could be erased violently, while Elizabeth herself remained untouchable, at least in public. Because the truth is, they couldn't put her on trial the same way they did her servants. To execute a noblewoman of her standing would have dragged the Bathory name through the mud, potentially destabilizing alliances and drawing unwanted scrutiny onto the noble class as a whole. So instead of an open trial with a public execution, a compromise was reached. Elizabeth was never formally convicted in court. Instead, she was sentenced to house arrest, though house arrest doesn't quite capture what it meant. A room in her own castle at Chait was walled up, bricked in, so that she could not leave. The stories say the space had no windows, just small slits for food and water to be passed through. For the rest of her life, she lived in darkness, cut off from the world she once ruled with fear. I find that punishment fascinating because in some ways, it was both merciful and cruel. On one hand, she wasn't executed. She wasn't tortured in the ways her victims had been. But on the other hand, she was buried alive in her own castle, left to fade away in silence and isolation. Perhaps the authorities believed this was a fitting end for someone who had inflicted so much suffering. Or perhaps it was simply the easiest way to make her disappear without scandal. Elizabeth remained in that prison for 4 years. According to one account, on the evening of August 20th, 1614, she complained to a guard that her hands felt cold. The guard reportedly told her to just lie down, that it was nothing. That night, Elizabeth Bathory, once one of the most feared women in Europe, died quietly in her bed at the age of 43. No drama, no spectacle, just an unremarkable death after a life built on horror. And that's what strikes me most. The woman accused of murdering hundreds who had allegedly bathed in blood to preserve her youth did not meet some fiery or gruesome end. Instead, she died in obscurity, surrounded not by victims but by walls of stone. For her, perhaps that isolation was its own form of torture. Even after her death, the controversy didn't fade. Some historians argue she was framed, that the accusations were exaggerated to strip her of land and power. Others insist the sheer number of testimonies, the consistency of the stories, prove her guilt beyond doubt. What we do know is that Elizabeth Bathory became legend, part history, part myth, and forever remembered as the Blood Countess. Chapter 8. Conclusion. Legacy and reflection. So where does that leave us with Elizabeth Bathory? Was she truly one of history's most prolific serial killers, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of young women? Or was she the victim of political enemies who saw an opportunity to destroy her reputation and seize her wealth? The truth, I think, lies somewhere in the shadows between fact and legend. What makes Elizabeth's story so haunting is how easy it is to believe. The brutality she's accused of, the biting, the burning, the bathing in blood, it's so extreme it almost feels like a horror story someone invented to scare children. And yet, the testimonies from her servants, the patterns of missing girls, and the sheer terror that surrounded her name all suggest that at least some of it was real. Even if the number wasn't 650, even if it was 50 or 100, that's still a staggering amount of human life lost. But here's the part I keep coming back to. Why did it take so long for anyone to stop her? The peasants had been whispering about missing daughters for years, but no one listened. Their voices didn't matter. Only when noble families started losing their children did people in power take action. And that tells us something deeply unsettling about the value of human life at that time. Justice wasn't blind, it was selective. It listened to privilege and ignored the powerless. Elizabeth's legend grew in the centuries after her death. She became known as the Blood Countess, sometimes even linked to vampire myths, earning comparisons to Count Dracula. Stories claimed she bathed in blood to preserve her youth, a detail that may have been more folklore than fact, but one that stuck because it captured the imagination. Even today, she's remembered less as a historical figure and more as a symbol of female monstrosity, an aristocrat who turned her wealth and privilege into instruments of terror. But I wonder too if her gender played a role in how her story was told. History tends to magnify the crimes of women in power, painting them as unnatural, grotesque, or evil in ways that male rulers often escape. Was Elizabeth truly more sadistic than the countless kings, generals, and noblemen who butchered thousands in war? Or was she judged differently because her violence didn't fit the mold of what women were supposed to be? That doesn't excuse what she did, but it's a question worth asking when we try to separate the woman from the legend. For me, the most chilling part of Elizabeth Bathory's story isn't the numbers or the blood rituals. It's the reminder of how cruelty can thrive when power goes unchecked. She lived in a world where status shielded her from consequences, where fear silenced witnesses, and where privilege mattered more than truth. And that's not just a story from the 1600s, that's a lesson that still resonates today. So whether she killed 600 girls or 60, Elizabeth Bathory remains a figure who forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and the darkness that can live inside human beings. Her life might be a mix of fact and myth, but the echoes of her story continue to haunt us because they reveal just how fragile the line is between protection and abuse, between legend and reality. And that's the story of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, a woman remembered not for her wealth or her lineage, But for the horror, her name still inspires more than 400 years later, and that brings us to the end of today's story. Elizabeth Bathory's life is a reminder of how easily history can blur the line between fact and legend. Was she truly the most prolific female serial killer in history, or was she the victim of powerful enemies who twisted her image into something monstrous? Maybe it's a little of both. What I take away from her story isn't just the horror of what she did or what she was accused of doing, but the silence that surrounded it for so long. The way society ignored missing peasant girls until noble families started to suffer. The way privilege shielded her from the consequences that anyone else would have faced immediately. To me, that silence is just as haunting as the crimes themselves. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe she really had hundreds of victims, or do you think the legend exaggerated her cruelty? Share your perspective in the comments below. I always love reading what you think. Thank you so much for spending this time with me here on True Crime Echoes. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss next week's case. Until then, stay safe, take care of each other, and I'll see you soon.